when I was walking here. I live in this neighborhood. This morning, there were at least 60 vendors with their beautiful clothes out there to play to this new audience in Fort Greene, which used to be a black semi-bourgeois neighborhood. It was known as Black Bohemia. It is now completely gentrified. You know, a building that was worth $250,000 in 1990 is now worth $6 million. So this is an asset inflation that we really could speak to that seems to have tremendous consequences to the housing market, to our everyday lives, etc. But I would like to, we're going to proceed with Rick on, who's going to give us a nice presentation about inflation, and then we'll move to Clara, who will talk about austerity. And she's really an expert on this. Again, I recommend this book. I'm not floored by a lot of books, but this was one of the ones that I really learned something from, and and I read a lot. So anyway, so I'm really pleased to have you here. And then we're going to have a dialogue between the two of them. They'll be questioning and trying to help us understand better a very complicated group of concepts. And so I'm going to turn it over to Rick, and he's going to stand at the podium, and I'm going to sit down.
Can everyone hear me? Yes? Yes. Yeah? Okay, good. All right. One of the first things to say is that it's always good to be able to talk about something that the audience already knows about. Since all of you spend money, either your own or other people's, you are aware that the prices of virtually everything has been going up for a while, and is indeed going up as we talk. There is a very simple definition of inflation, and probably the best advice I can give you is to think simply. Mostly what economists like me do, we learned from lawyers. Lawyers take a simple idea, like, for example, I'm going to deliver to you a bag of potatoes in 2 weeks, and you're going to give me $10 for the potatoes. I show up with the potatoes, you don't have $10, you only have $5, we've got a problem. This has all been rendered in simple English. The job of the lawyer is to write laws about all of this in language that nobody can possibly understand unless they hire a lawyer who will translate the language back into the simple-minded concepts with which the story began. That's what most economics is. Very complicated language to obscure from you what is going on in the economy. And so those of you who have enough money can hire us, who will translate back into the simple story what the language obscured. And inflation then is simply when prices in general go up. That's it. Nothing complicated here. It doesn't mean that all the prices go up the same amount. It doesn't even mean that all the prices go up. Some can go down. But as long as the general direction of most goods and services is going up in terms of price, that's an inflation. Well, then the question becomes, why has capitalism as a system over and over again found itself troubled by inflations? So much so that institutions were set up over the history of capitalism to stop that, to prevent it. In general, they have failed to do that. Just like the system set up institutions to handle another peculiarity, something called the business cycle, the endless sequence of depressions, mass unemployment, recovery, all of that has been plaguing capitalism for at least 2 to 3 centuries. The National Bureau of Economic Research tells us that downturns in capitalism come on average every 4 to 7 years. Sometimes you'll find an outlier, it takes longer than that or shorter, but 4 to 7 is the average. And if you think about it, we had the so-called dot-com crash in 2000. Then we had the so-called Great Recession crash of 2008 and 9. And then we had the COVID-19 crash, so-called, in 2020. 21 years, 3 crashes, once every 7 years, right on target. And we have enormous institutions in economics. We even have a whole science of economics named after the fellow who started it, Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, and we have Keynesian economics, all of which was supposed to deal with these cycles. Well, if you pick up today's Wall Street Journal, you'll find several articles wondering when the next one will hit and how bad it'll be. In other words, the effort to prevent there being cycles is a failure. Haven't figured out how to do it. And they haven't figured out how to deal with inflations either. So I'm going to start my little talk by telling you about not the current one, but the last one, because it'll awaken in you, I think, an awareness of the punchline that I will give you at the end of this story. So I'm going to take you back to 1971. It's August, it's very hot, and on the 15th of that month, August 15, 1971, a roaring good inflation was bedeviling U.S. capitalism. So much so that people were doing then what they're doing now, complaining that it was costly to go to the supermarket and fill up a brown bag of your groceries and then pay that much money relative to what people were earning then. And it was beginning to become a political problem. So the President of the United States at that time had to do something. His name, just to remind you, Richard M. Nixon, great man, like so many of our presidents have been and are. And Mr. Nixon, a conservative Republican, got on the radio and television, and he did something remarkable. He said, I have to deal with this inflation, and I have decided to do it. And here's the deal. As of tomorrow morning, that would have been the 16th of August, 1971, any business in this country, United States, that raises its price, thereby contributing to the inflation, we will come for you, we will arrest you, and we will throw you in jail. I didn't make this up. That's what we did. Any union that pushes the wages up, same thing. This policy was called at the time a wage price freeze. The inflation stopped on a dime. It turns out employers and unions did not want to get arrested, and were afraid they might if they violated this order. It was originally for 90 days, 3 months. It was extended for much more. All right, so let's review. You have an inflation. It's a problem. And the system at the time solved the problem by a wage price freeze. Fast forward to the last 2.5 years that we've had an inflation in this country. What do you think about the debate we had in the United States as to the uses of the same policy tool we used last time, the wage price freeze? If you wait for a debate, you will be waiting a long time. No such debate happened. I will not embarrass you by asking you if you were even aware that there was such a thing as a wage price freeze used by a conservative Republican president just a few decades ago. We just went through a period, continuing right now, in which the leaders of our government acted as though the inflation was some sort of problem that descended on the society by some deus ex machina or something strange, and then proceeded to act as though raising interest rates was the only, the obvious, the appropriate step to be taken, and they took it. Now think with me in a simple way. If people are suffering from prices going up, and the response of the government is to raise interest rates, it means that not only does the Rice Krispies cost you more, but using your credit card to buy the Rice Krispies will now cost you more too. In other words, the cure made the problem worse. The promise was it would solve the problem, which it has not done. We are still at about 4% rate of price increases, and we have not recovered from the past one. Very strange, very hard to make sense. Now, one of the chief architects of all of this is Janet Yellen, currently the Secretary of the Treasury, formerly head of the Federal Reserve, and so on. Does she understand what I just said? Absolutely. I know that because she and I were classmates in the same PhD economics program at the same time. She had the same professor I did, the same classes I did, in the same room that we listened to the professor, and we read the same articles that were assigned to. I know very well that she knows what I've just told you. But you wouldn't know it listening to her. For her, it's all about interest rates going up. Why am I telling you this? Because I want you to understand that you are not being told much about all of this. Some of you actually believe that prices go up because, and I love this, supply chain disruptions. Some of you actually learned that phrase, the supply chain, which means that the supplies going into production, the inputs of a business, got disrupted. They didn't show up on time, or they weren't there, or they were delayed. Every large corporation has something called a purchasing managing department, where they hire purchasing managers. And the job of them is to make sure that the flow of inputs needed in that business is secure. Try to imagine with me the arrival of a purchasing manager talking to the CEO saying, I'm terribly sorry that we don't have this input or that one. You see, there's a supply chain disruption. At that point, the CEO smiles and says 2 words, you're fired. Because it is the job of the purchasing manager to have anticipated these things and had a plan B and a plan C and a plan D. That's what they're paid to do. To tell the public a supply disruption is, to use a technical term, lying through your teeth. It's because you don't want to explain what it is that's going on. So let me, in a few minutes, tell you what it is. And we're going to be very simple here because that's the truth of it all. First, if inflation is rising prices, the logical next question is, well, who sets the prices? I mean, where does that come from? Some of you may believe that up in the sky is a gentleman with a beard who plays the harp who actually determines prices. Human beings used to believe that, but most of you probably don't. On the other hand, the people that lead us will try to suggest it. Some of them already do. But we know that. We know it. You all know it too. Employers set prices. So if there's an inflation, here's what you know. The employers of America made a decision to raise their prices. This is the only way that happens. If you've been an employee all your life, you may have noticed the following. Your boss never asked you to come into his office and help him decide what to charge for whatever it is you help to produce. Never happens. Employees don't set prices. Employers do. According to the U.S. Census, 3% of Americans are employers. The rest of us, 97%, are not. So an inflation is a decision made by 3% of the people that everybody has to obey. Oh, honey, you don't have to pay more for the Rice Krispies, but then your breakfast will be a glass of water. If you want the Rice Krispies, you pay what the Kellogg Corporation decides you will pay. An inflation is the worst enemy of democracy and vice versa. There's nothing democratic about it. You have never participated in any political process that resulted in determining what the price of Rice Krispies or anything else you buy will cost you. That the American people, or for that matter any people, accept this is astonishing. If democracy means you participate in making the decisions that affect your lives, and that after all is the rationale why we vote for the mayor, because the mayor makes decisions that affect us, and so we have at least the power to vote for the mayor. Well, the employers have an ability to affect us by making us pay $812 for a box of Rice Krispies, if they so choose. We don't have any power over that other than to have a glass of water for breakfast. It's remarkable when you think about it. Okay, let's take it the next step. Why do employers raise prices? Because that's what an inflation is when they do that. So we have the right to ask, why do they do it? And we know the answer. You do too. I'm just going to put it into words. If you go to business school, and I've taught at business schools, if you go to business school, you can reduce much of what goes on there, and there isn't much, but you can reduce that which there is in the business school to the following advice you give aspiring young businessmen and women, the entrepreneurs of the future. Okay? Go where the wages are cheap and where the market is growing. That's what you should do. And why? Because that will maximize your profits. And that's the success you're looking for. So the answer to the question, why do employers raise prices, is because it's profitable to do that. The same reasons of everything else they do. So now we know we have an inflation when employers raise prices to boost their profits. And that's why they do it. And by the way, all the subtlety is right in there. If raising the price would lead lots numbers of people to not buy the product, well, then they won't do it. Why? Because that would not get you more profits. You'd raise the price, but you'd lose so many sales, would cancel out. You wouldn't do it. So we know when there's an inflation, it's because it's going to raise profits. So here we have it. 3% of the people pursuing profits give us an inflation when and if that's the best way they can make more money, profits. By the way, if there are other better ways of making profits, then they don't have to raise their prices, and they often don't. They pursue the other way to maximize their profits. That's why you sometimes have inflation, and sometimes you don't. Here's a way and a reason you often don't have an inflation. If you can knock down the wages you pay people, you can make more profits that way. You don't need to raise the prices. Which means many of us have a real choice in this democratic society. But that was an attempt at humor. We may not be hit with an inflation. We may just be hit with wage reduction. Okay. Those are the choices we get. Don't tell me we don't have freedom of choice. We got it. There it was. The freedom of choice. Let me try to get at this another way. Prices are just a way of deciding who gets what. Just think about it. And to help you, I'm going to give you another historical example. Clara makes really good use in her book of historical, getting into the history of austerity. Opens it up for people in a way nothing else does. Often that way with history. So we're going to go to the middle of the early 1940s. The United States is about to enter the war. President Franklin Roosevelt. The decision is made, we're going to go into World War II. It's going to be difficult. And in order to fight World War II, we have to take huge amounts of our resources, our iron, our steel, you name it, and put them to the war effort to make guns and bullets and planes and tanks and all the apparatus of war. And that means resources devoted to peacetime production, goods and services that people normally consume, they're not going to be there. Those resources have been shifted over, will be shifted over to military production. And you know what that means? We're going to have a lot fewer popular goods and services than we are used to having. Or to use a simple language, we're going to have a shortage of consumer goods because we're fighting a war. Now, how are we going to handle it? How are we going to distribute the shortage of consumer goods to our people? Now, we could use the price mechanism, the free market, a moment of silence. We could use that, and here's how that would work. We would announce that every store that had 50 boxes of Rice Krispies will now be possessed of 25 boxes of Rice Krispies because we've moved the resources for the other 25 into military, so it's not available. And here's what will happen. You and I will go to the store and say, we want a box of Rice Krispies. Yeah, but we'll discover that the clerk is already talking to the richest person in town who turns out to love Rice Krispies. And that person, knowing how this game works, says, oh, what's the normal price of a box of rice? $3. You know what, says the rich guy, I'll give you 20. Whoa, says the clerk, $20. Sold. You're coming, you have $5 in your pocket. You are, to use a technical term, screwed. You're not going to get Rice Krispies. You're going to learn to love water for breakfast. In other words, that's how markets work. Whatever is scarce, you bid up the price. You keep bidding it up. More and more people with not much money can't afford it anymore. They're not anymore asking the clerk. They're going outside to hide behind a tree and cry about the Rice Krispies they'll never eat again. The price mechanism worked. It equated the reduced supply to the now reduced demand. That's how markets work. By rationing. This is really what it's doing. It's rationing the scarce product according to how much money people have. Let me say that again. A market system distributes rare shortage things in shortage, things that are rare, things that are scarce, by giving them, in effect, to those with the most money. They decided in World War II, the government of the United States, that they could not afford the risk of relying on the market. These were people who clearly had not learned about libertarianism. They realized that if you leave things to the free market, you're going to have war inside the United States, because the mass of people who are poor will be watching the scarce goods they can no longer enjoy go only to the people with the money to buy them. Have you got 3 little children who need milk? Screw you. The rich people are going to buy the milk for their cats. That's how it works. So Roosevelt and his advisors decided to, get ready, abolish the free market. Too dangerous. You couldn't have the bitterness of the population, poor against rich, when you were about to try to fight a world war. You needed solidarity. So the government said, no more will a long list of consumer goods be distributed by the market. Screw the market. And the government printed and distributed ration cards, ration tickets they were called, to the American people. By the way, I didn't make any of this up. Go check it. You'll see it's the history of your country, my country. The government of the United States distributed ration cards. The way you got a quart of milk, a pound of sugar, a pound of meat, a gallon of gas for your vehicle, you had to have a ticket. If you bought it for money and the storekeeper sold it to you for money, both of you would be liable for arrest and imprisonment. It was a crime. You could only get these objects if you had a ticket. And how were the tickets distributed? Those of you with a little Marxism in your blood are going to love this. To each according to their needs. If you had a lot of children, you got a lot of milk tickets. If you were an elderly couple with no children, you didn't get any milk tickets. Ooh. The government decided, oh God, how many tickets? That way you made sure that there weren't some people who got all the scarce consumer goods. You made sure they were distributed in a way that appeared to the people who administered this program to be reasonable and fair. There was no inflation of consumer goods. The whole price mechanism had been pushed aside, so the issue was moot. Everything was now handled by a non-price distribution system, a non-market. And it wasn't the Soviet Union who abolished the market, was it? It was the United States that abolished the market because it was deemed grossly unfair. My God, what a thing to say. Nowadays, we bend over and bow to the market. It is the efficient allocator of resources. Not then it wasn't. It was considered, if you were to advocate going back to the market at that time, that you were, I'll be polite, a moron, and not to be taken seriously. Guess what? A thought for you. Maybe it's still that you're a moron. Maybe there are lots of things we could rather see than a distribution of anything by the market. Really? You want to distribute things according to how much money people have to spend on them? Is that the best way? You can't come up with a better way of distributing things than that? So that some people hoard in their garage 400 electric ovens because they're crazy and they need stuff in the garage because they believe, as an article of their religion, that the person with the most unopened boxes of things in the garage when they die wins. Come on. And inflation is when this price mechanism really works in the way it's intended, to allocate in very particular ways, chiefly to those with the most money. They're the ones who win from a market system. They always have. That's why they like it. It's not because it's efficient. It isn't. The efficient way to win World War II was the way the United States chose. Kick the market out, have a completely different system. That was efficient to solve the problem of the war. What would be efficient to deal with the social problems in the United States? Maybe not distribute by the money. Here's a moment, I'll finish with this, when you all see it, and even in our population we see it. It's when inflation has a particular name. We like to do that because we don't want to see that it's the same problem across the board. So we give it names. When you have an inflation in housing, we call it gentrification. Give it this funny name. You know what's scarce? The land in Manhattan or the land in New York City. The boundaries were set many years ago. We know what's inside New York City, and we know what's outside. We know what's inside Manhattan, we know what's outside. So that's scarce. How does the market work? The richer you are, the more you can afford to bid up the apartment, the condo, the co-op, whatever you're looking for. People want to live in New York City and San Francisco and a few other places you all know. And rich people want to go there, so they go there, and they do exactly what I told you before about Rice Krispies, only now it's about housing. So the rents go up and the price of housing go up, and what happens to everybody else? Well, you couldn't have Rice Krispies, so you had a glass of water. So you don't live in Manhattan, you live in fill in the blank. The further away, the cheaper it'll probably be. And you'll save money on your rent and piss it away on your commute. Yeah, you all know the game. You're the victims of this game. You all know the irony. The rich people decide it would be cool to live where the artists are, with their quaint little studios and their lovely little shops. And then they go in and they bid up the price so the artists can't afford to stay there. And the little shops go and they have another endless series of large banks and CVS stores. And it has all the character of the underside of your shoe. It's self-defeating. It's absurd gentrification. The very people who cause it complain about it when they're done and move on to the next place where they do it again. The irrationality is beyond words. In many parts of the world, you don't allow that because it's so destructive. Conclusion. There is nothing necessary about markets or prices or inflations. If you didn't have the market, you wouldn't have the inflation. If you didn't have capitalism, you wouldn't have the inequality that makes us rely on markets because it favors the people at the top. Inflations happen because it's profitable for employers to do that. That's why it happens. That's when it happens. And they love nothing more than to keep the prices rising a little bit ahead of the wages rising so that it becomes a profit engine for them. And that they thereby move wealth from the mass of people who can't keep up to those who set the prices. Inflation is a tool of the capitalist system that the mass of people should be as upset and opposed to as they are to the extremes of wealth and poverty that are all around us and all of the social horror that flows from it. Instead, our leaders and our economists deal with it as if it were some sort of technical problem that they can manage. I hope what I've shown you is that they didn't manage it, that the ways in which they managed it have been kept from you, the rationing and the wage price freeze, and that the whole thing is a hustle that ought to be among the major items that are challenged when people are thinking critically or able to think critically about capitalism. Thank you.
So thank you, Rick, and now we're going to hear Clara Navratilova, and she's going to speak again on the invention of austerity, right? As a power.
So thank you so much. First of all, I would really like to thank the organizers of the conference because I see that Palestine is a central theme in this conference, and at this historical moment, speaking about anything that isn't the genocide in Gaza feels superfluous. But I also think that what we are talking about here is really intrinsically connected to the capitalist economic system that indeed thrives in killing people, massacring people, and oppressing the majority. So I think more than ever in this historical moment, we realize how democracy and capitalism are incompatible concepts. And the horrors in Gaza, I think, are really a wake-up call for many, many people around the world. And this is something that I think should empower us to continue pushing for a different narrative. And this is why the different narrative that Rick proposed is very important. And I would like to continue on a couple of themes that came up. The first is the theme about how economics is all political, not technical. That there is no objectivity, no neutrality, neither in the economic science, nor in the economic policies that supposedly stem from these economic science, because the system itself is political. The economic mechanism that dominate our lives and organized society are intrinsically about preserving what ultimately has become the title of my book, which is the capital order. Growth, economic growth, which sounds like such a great thing and something that, again, appears very objective because you can quantify it with numbers, is based on a social relation, right? So money itself, wealth, accumulation of wealth, depends on the fact that the majority of people in the globe have no alternative but to go work for a wage, and often a low one, right? So the fact that you have to sell your capacity to work in exchange for a wage is the economic compulsion that is a defining feature of our economic system with respect to others, right? So this is why, of course, inflation is not technical, it's political, because the system itself is based on the most political relation of all, which is the relation of exploitation, meaning that we have no agency over the production process, nor we get to, of course, maintain the value of what we produced. Now, this sounds obvious to the people in this room, but I think it's something that we really need to reflect on, because it's ultimately a really empowering insight. In fact, one realizes that the reason why economists have to constantly propel impotence amongst people. So have to constantly maintain impotence as the main feeling that we have when we hear about what is happening in Gaza and when we hear about inflation, is because ultimately they know way better than us that the system is way more fragile than they want us to think, right? We are raised in thinking that the system is spontaneous, that is natural, that it ultimately is a reflection of who we are as human beings, as rational maximizers. Well, guess what? Actually, given that the system is based on the subordination of the majority, it is a system that it is really easy to overturn and change. And this is why I think one of the themes that Rick pointed out I want to stress is not only that this is all political, it's also that the mechanisms that those who embody the logic of capitalism provide work. Inflation works for its purposes. And not only inflation works for its purposes, what works much better is the reaction to inflation. So one point that I want to stress is how austerity is all but a policy mistake. It's great when you hear Keynesian, colleagues who want to play the part of the progressive economist telling us, austerity is just bad policy coming out of bad theory, and ultimately it's all irrational. Now, my answer to this is, well, you say this because you've completely got stuck in the ideological form that depoliticizes the economy. So you just think capital is money and not capital as a social relation. Because if you realize that capital is a social relation, then you also realize that austerity is very intelligent and works very well for the purpose that it is supposed to serve, which is that of protecting and preserving the capital order. So the best way to stabilize our economy is to make sure people don't complain and accept their position as low-paid wage workers, right? And this is exactly the purpose of austerity. So not only does Rick tell us that they don't really discuss why inflation emerges, they tell us that inflation emerges because people are misbehaving. If you actually look at the economic models that explain inflation, they use technical words to fundamentally tell us that it's people who are consuming too much and working too little, right? The blame once more rests on the working class, and thus obviously the solution is interest rate hikes, because we know, and not just us, Janet Yellen, Jerome Powell, they all know that the very purpose of increasing interest rates is to have a direct impact on the labor market, right? They tell us the labor market now is too tight to unhealthy levels. This is what they say. They say it outright. They're telling us that 4% inflation is way too low. And if you calculate how many people that is, so because we know that how they calculate the unemployment rate doesn't count those who are not looking for jobs, doesn't count the fact that many people are counted as employed, work just a couple of hours a week, but that doesn't matter. The point is, this amount of unemployment is still not enough for the system to work in a healthy manner. For them, what is healthy is clearly not what is healthy for the majority. So this is another theme I think that came out from what Rick was saying, and I want to stress, is that what works for the system does not work for us. And this needs to be spelled out in large letters, because I think it is really the insight that makes everyone into anti-capitalist. What works for the capitalist economy does not work for us. And moreover, the capitalist economy works when we are actively screwed. Okay? And this is just how it is, right? So interest rate hikes will indeed slow down the labor market, which means that unemployment is going to go up, there will be less job openings, and this will cool down the excessive demands of the working class. And we know that in the United States, this is ultimately what is preoccupying those at the top, is the fact that the working class is demanding and winning a lot of economic battles. And not only people are winning their economic battles, and Rick on his economic update does a great job at keeping us posted on how many economic battles are actually being won by the workers, something that, again, the mainstream media doesn't like to talk about. But it's also about the fact that there's a lot of people who are refusing to engage in wage labor, right? There's active refusal to even accept the founding social relation that is at the basis of economic growth as we know it in this society. So this is where austerity is so important. Austerity, again, is not a policy mistake. It is very rational for the system, and it works to weaken the working class constantly. How? Well, I talk about in my book. My book is actually about the historical episode after the First World War, because it actually has a lot of parallels with what is happening today. Because after the First World War, exactly because the state had, in a way, shown how political the economy was in participating in ultimately disciplining and workers during the war and becoming the main employer, the main producer. We can't get into that. But what is important is that after the First World War, there were a lot of experiments for a post-capitalist society that were being practically proposed and operated. And that's what I do in my first part of the book, is actually get into the details about all of the different experiments that were going on, not just in Russia and the Eastern Europe, but in the hub of Western capitalism, Italy and Great Britain, right? So it actually was in the United States as well. Workers' councils, cooperatives, self-management of labor, organized also through state intervention, many things. Guild socialism and so forth. Well, it is in that moment that the austerity trinity as we know it today kind of emerged. And again, it operated very successfully to foreclose all of these alternatives and to stabilize the economy as we know it today. And how do you do it? Well, we have monetary austerity, what is more relevant for this talk. So again, increasing interest rates that doesn't just screw us over as consumers because it's difficult to ultimately get mortgages at a decent price or, pay our credit card bills. It's mostly the fact that we lose as workers because we lose our jobs, and thus we lose our bargaining power. And everyone knows, including Janet Yellen, who was working for Alan Greenspan in the 90s and was said explicitly what, anyone who studies political economy knows, which is the fact that unemployment, again, is not a mistake of the system. It is structurally functional to the preservation of the capital order because it disciplines workers into accepting what are ultimately the healthy wages for our society to grow, right? So ultimately, the disciplinary mechanism of unemployment is crucial, and that's what interest rate hikes does. It makes sure that it operates for the system. Then we have, of course, not just monetary austerity, we have what I call fiscal austerity. And fiscal austerity, I'm just going to say a couple more things and then I close because I would like to continue the conversation. But just to give you some, I think, points. Fiscal austerity, why I care about the definition is that the definition we get from economists is completely empty. First of all, you never hear the word austerity because it's ultimately everywhere and completely integral to the functioning of capitalism. But when we do hear about the word austerity, we hear it in a way that is completely empty. Why? Because it looks at the aggregate. Usually, if you look at a definition on the dictionary, if you Google it, you will see that it's all about budget cuts and tax increases. This is the typical definition that economists like because it looks at the whole, at the aggregate, and tells you nothing about who actually wins and who loses. Because if you look what austerity is about, it's about cutting social expenditures. So where is the state not spending? And the state is not spending in social services, right? Cutting structurally healthcare, education, transport. We don't need to say that, it's obvious, everywhere, both in the south and in the north of the globe. And this, again, is not stupid for the system because it actually helps preserve what is fundamental for society, which is market dependence. If you have to pay for getting your leg operated, if you have to pay to send your your kid to a decent school, you will be more actively accepting a wage job in shittier conditions, right? If you have to basically buy everything you need to be a human being, of course you will be willing to bow to the wage relation. So again, fiscal austerity is about cutting social expenditures, and the state instead spending a ton of money on those who supposedly are leading our economy and then deciding on the prices, as Rick was pointing out, which is the saver investors, right? How? Well, the state is, the military-industrial complex has never had such high profits in history. The state is actively, the Bidenomics is completely in line with the logic of austerity. Bidenomics is about the state spending a ton of money to subsidize private asset managers who are ultimately now leading the green transition. This is austerity. It's, again, the state spending for those who supposedly are those who are in charge. Well, we all have to accept our subordinated position. Then fiscal austerity is also about taxation. Again, it's not about just raising taxes. What the hell does that mean? It's about regressive taxation. You raise taxes on the working people, consumption taxes go up. We very well know in the United States how much workers pay more taxes than those who make a living off of accumulated wealth, right? And I don't need to get into the details, but it is structural to this society. Corporate taxes get cut. Inheritance tax is basically inexistent, but more than that, it is just the fact that when you make money off of capital wealth, you're just not taxed in this country, right? So that is regressive taxation. That is the other element of fiscal austerity. So cuts in social expenditure and regressive taxation. Now, this is, again, monetary, fiscal, and then we have industrial austerity, which is very important because it's the state not only indirectly subordinating the workers, but directly doing so. How? By privatizing, again, increasing market dependence and securing profits, by deregulating the labor market, something that is really big in Europe. In the United States, it's so deregulated, we don't really even know what that means, but, really screwing over unions, and ultimately sometimes even directly intervening to curb labor, to curb the bargaining power of workers. Biden intervened to stop the strike of the transport workers, of the railway workers, right, recently. So this is something that shows you how the free market is a complete construction because, and this is where I would like to close, for me it is very important that, again, we use these insights in an empowering way. We realize that system A is much more unstable, not just economically, but ultimately politically, which is what counts, because, again, our economy is based on a political relation. And this means that the state has to constantly intervene actively as a life support for our economy. Okay? So the idea that there are markets without state, that's of course pure ideological construction. The state has to play a constant role in maintaining the capital order. And of course, the point is that what for the system are solutions, namely unemployment, precarity, poverty. What these things for us are problems, right? According to a criteria that is a human criteria, all of these would be considered problems. They are instead, again, solutions for the system, and this is really, really important to note. These are not mistakes. It is irrational according to the logic of human needs. It's not irrational according to the logic of profits. And we have to be very careful when we talk about the economy to make that clear. Otherwise, we risk ending up in the wishy-washy rhetoric that is typical of Keynesian economists that then appropriate the space of supposed progressive economics, and this is really a problem. So I'm done, and now maybe I can ask a couple of questions to Rick, and then we can open it up. Thanks.
If I could just say, it seems to me where you began 1971 was the beginning of the Friedman School of Monetary policy, right? Started. taking over from fiscal policy, and I know that you have many analyses of the surplus, how it's distributed, and also the history of how capital regulates from the New Deal through the 60s up until the 70s. So maybe that would be a good starting point to see how the Federal Reserve's role in this, all the way through the 70s, the Volcker shock effect, what relationship this may have had both to inflation and austerity, and kind of take that up as a new model that capital, maybe not so new, but certainly one that's become dominant for the last 50 years.
Yeah, I think the important insight there, which I said in one way and Clara said in the other, to underline, is this is a very political operation. The whole notion that the economy is a separate sphere, that there is the economy that you can talk about by itself, that there's a wing of the university devoted to economics, which is carefully separated by at least walls and buildings from history and political science and cultural phenomena. It's all crazy. It has nothing to do with the reality of what's going on. Even in the profession of economics, it was once called political economy. The people who started it are credited with being the founders, Smith and Ricardo and so on. They called their work political economy because the idea of separating out what the government does, what the political system does from what happens in the economy would have struck them as absurd, making no sense at all. So it's been a very careful evolution of the so-called science of economics to cleanse itself from its connections with other, to make it therefore much easier to, in the modern lingo, mathematicize it, to imagine that you could capture the complex richness of economic behavior and decision-making by an equation, by a stick figure math problem that you solve, which carefully abstracts from all the other dimensions of what's going on. So Michael is right. 1971 is a very loaded period of time. It's the end of the post-war commitment. Remember, the Great Depression of the 1930s was summarized in terms of what people learned from it. The summary was, if you leave the private market and private capitalism to its own devices, you get the Great Depression. Capitalism was the problem. Governmental intervention was the solution. My little story about using rationing, perfect example. And there were many others. And for most of the post-war period, the notion that the government has to come in to prevent the system not just from being unfair, unjust, unequal, but from blowing itself up was accepted everywhere. But the irony, and I would stress this to you, the irony of that period, roughly 1945, 1970, something like that, the irony was that the intervention of the government was not able to stabilize the system either. It didn't work. It turned large numbers of people who had looked at Franklin Roosevelt as the savior of the United States, who had thought that government intervention was the solution, private capitalism was the problem. After 30 years, Reagan comes along and reverses that argument. The government is the problem, private capitalism is the solution. That's right. This craziness wobbles back and forth. You had Keynesian-type people in Argentina for 40 years, and now you have a lunatic a libertarian nutbag with a strange haircut. I mean, you have to listen to this guy. You wouldn't believe it. You would not believe. He rides around Buenos Aires brandishing a chainsaw. He's going to tear down all the government screwing up. So we have a religion that the government is the problem and the private sector is the solution, like we had a religion before. But notice that both of them are careful to make a point. And both Clara and I were careful to make the opposite point. Their point is the system is not the problem. Capitalism, the relationship of employer to employee, is totally innocent. Wherever there's a problem, it's somebody else's fault. It may be that a large ship got stuck in the Suez Canal at a bad angle. What? It's that the Federal Reserve raised interest rates too much or too little. We can argue forever about that. In the end, no one cares. The system keeps going, which is what the ups and downs are designed to do. That's why it's not a problem that the government was supposed to prevent business cycles. The business community doesn't like business cycles either. Nobody wants business cycles, and this system can't do without them. That's a deep, deep contradiction of this system. It holds on to that which is its most fundamental, foundational structure. And that's as Clara said very clearly at the beginning of her talk, that's the relationship between employer and employee. That's the core of capitalism, always was. Just like the core of feudalism was the lord and the serf, or the core of slavery was the master and the slave. We are the tradition that carries on that dichotomy. The tiny group of people at the top who run everything, the masters versus the slaves, the lords versus the serfs, the employers versus the employees. Notice something? We were all supposed to believe that the revolution that overthrew slavery, or that overthrew feudalism, or even the one supposedly overthrowing capitalism, would make sure that everything changed. But it won't change if you don't deal with that basic organization of the work process. Whether it's the factory, the office, or the store. If it's an employer and an employee, you've got the seed there of all the rest that we talk about. You don't deal with that, and you will not solve the problems. You will endlessly oscillate between the inflation and the depression, between the up and the down of a continuing system whose only real long-term trend, and even that, is to make people richer and poorer, to divide the country, to make the extremes. And when we even address that, which we periodically do, in the United States, every 20 years, people wake up and say, oh my God, we got a lot of poverty. And then what do? Anything and everything other than change the employer-employee relationship. We'll raise taxes on the rich. We'll do this. We'll do that. And we do some of these things, and they never solve the problem. And we cannot ask the question, what about the basic system? What does it mean that we cannot discuss how and why and where the policy decisions do not transform, let alone, they don't even admit that the employer-employee relationship has itself to be questioned, alternatives to it have to be charged and looked at.
And I think it goes back to the issue about how I think in this historical moment we have to, as people more or less agreeing on the left, we have to be courageous enough to realize that actually attempting to reform capitalism is much more utopian than trying to actually like change the pillars, meaning wage relations and private property means of production. And this is actually a lessons we can take from history, because actually the so-called, golden years, which is actually the period I'm trying, hopefully, if I ever have time to do any research in my life, supposedly my next project is to relook at those years critically, because again, if we go beyond if we try to actually change the narrative, the dominant narrative by which, it's either more government or more market, and realize that actually when it is about austerity capitalism, it is all about the government. The government just structurally shifting resources from the many to the few. So the government is constantly intervening. It's not like, from Reagan onward, there was like the government stepped back. No. We very well know that so-called neoliberalism, even if it's a word I don't like very much, it's all about the government stepping in. The point is that the government is stepping in to act according to the logic of capital accumulation, to enhance the logic of capital accumulation, which is the logic that has to preserve market dependence of the majority while incentivizing the profit expectations of those who indeed are in charge of the economic decisions that then affect all of us, right? So again, how if we understand this, we also understand that during the Golden Age, what the governments were doing, I think, was much more limited than what we think, and this is where I will substantiate it with more elements of research. But already from what I read, what you realize is that the specter of inflation, the fear of destabilizing the economy, constantly put brakes to any form of serious economic redistribution. So what we know, obviously, is that wages were going up because productivity was increasing. So this was not affecting, indeed, the profit rate. But in terms of what the government was doing to redistribute resources, what you find out is that the most, Keynesian measure was actually tax cuts on the rich. That was basically all the counter, because the counter-cyclical was about actually moments of economic growth, making sure the economy was not heating up too much. And this goes back to the problem of inflation, because inflation, an expression of when the economy is heating up, is more than an economic problem, really a political problem. Again, you can't separate the two, as it's been the theme of the course of the talk. Because ultimately what you realize is that what is worrisome about inflation is that people get pissed off. People get really pissed off and start demanding either higher wages or something to happen, right? And this is when the curtain of the consensus, all the effort to build consensus for this absurd economic system we're in, risks falling. And this is the real concern for inflation. It's the political consequences, the mobilization of people in direction that might not be capitalist. And this is ultimately what happened, I think, in the early 70s, is that ultimately what you realize is that the system is more fragile when people are doing better. And this is where I think I go against the accelerationist story of a lot of Marxian literature, is actually what you find out is that places where there is more push to transcend the capital order are those places where people have the resources to actually have the time to meet, to talk, to unionize, to discuss. And this is ultimately what happened in the 60s and 70s, that people were doing better. And so there were, people, we know the racial element. So, the few white workers were doing better. This was enough, though, to create mobilization to try to push away from the capital order. So what I want to stress here is that it is much more utopian to try to reform the system, because if within capitalism, we say we have an enlightened, we have Bernie Sanders finally in government, we're all cheering and happy. And Bernie Sanders finally decides to actually take a step and try to actually maybe do some redistributive reforms in favor of the workers. this is, it's a slippery slope in the sense that truly, if you politicize the economy, if you show people that actually, guess what, the state could give you more. Look at what happened during COVID. The state did send you a check in your mail, in your mail. Well, then people are like, why the fuck should we go back and work for a wage? So once the state does something that is not austerity, it risks politicizing the economic space in a way that mobilizes and actually brings agency back to people. And this for the system is really bad. Again, it's good for us, but not good for the system. This is why ultimately social redistribution within the capitalist system is for me ultimately an incompatible solution, because it will push people to ask for a different society. And so ultimately I think the reality is that we need to really, really be courageous and think outside the box. That's why when we say Bidenomics as a change of paradigm, it's not a change of paradigm at all. It's reinforcing the wage relation. It's actually just giving more money again at the top, right? So we need to stop thinking that when we say the government is going to intervene as if this is good for the people. It's not. Because if it were good for the people, it might fuck up the system, which is something that politicians are going to be very careful in doing, just because the consequences for those in power are not so great in that case, right?
We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Yes, just one second. I just want to make one comment of what Clara said. She shows her philosophical background here in terms of social redistribution. One of the most popular books during the 70s and 80s was John Rawls's Theory of Justice, in which he calls for fair capitalism. So this is something we should fight all the time. It's one of the tricks of the bourgeois philosophers.
The real class enemy, yes.
Yes, the class enemy. Yes. So I'll open it up. Yeah.
Hi. Question mostly for Richard, but I would like to call you Professor Wolf. My understanding and the way you explained it clearly, inflation is built up in the system. And historically, we have seen 1-digit percentage inflation. Nowadays, the inflation we face is usually 2 digits. 12%, as you said, depends on the item, some merchandise or whatever assets do not increase. But, as you mentioned, the building was 240,000 in 1989, right? And now it's 6 million. So it's built up in the capitalist system, this inflation. And I'm a math guy, and sometimes when I teach business calculus, I tell them, taking on an average that the inflation under normal conditions is, let's say, 4%. Of course, when we get a raise 2%, we are losing 2%. And we run how many years it would take for something to double. It comes out to be about 2 decades, something, assuming 4% inflation. So that's one thing. In other words, inflation was always there since the beginning of capitalism, I believe, in the system. But there are periods that we get it 2-digit, 3-digit, or even during depressions in Germany, it was economical. That's one thing. If you can elaborate on that a little bit further, we don't have much time. And the second aspect is we have inflation and deflation. Can you elaborate a little bit under what circumstances we face, the society faces deflation? Recently, something that a little bit before the war, there was a deflation that the U.S. government had to face. It was FDR or Hoover. Basically, deflation, under what circumstances deflation? Thank you.
If I understood correctly, yes, there is, in many periods of capitalism's history, a tendency towards inflation. And I don't think that's a mystery. It's because in most cases, for all kinds of historical and political reasons, it is easier for the employers to raise the prices than it is for the workers to raise the wages. If that's true, then you're always going to see a kind of tilting towards inflation because it's a profit generator. You are able to switch resources, wealth, from the mass of people because their ability to raise their wages lags or is less than the ability of the employer. It really is very easy with the stroke of a pen for an employer to raise prices. If there's a union contract, the workers are forbidden, even by the contract, from raising their wages unless they're prepared to strike, and that's a whole other question of power and does not exist in capitalism as a long-term tendency to do that sort of thing. So yeah, I would not be surprised, and I am not surprised, that over the longer haul, the tendency there's a tendency for prices to go up. Then there are situations where the politics is more immediately intervening, and then you have the lunacy of the system unfolding. The best example, as you point to, is Germany in 1923. For those of you who don't know, very briefly, Germany lost World War I. And the way that situation was handled by the capitalists who won was to require that Germany pay the costs of the war that it lost. You see that now in the effort to use the money stolen from Russia at the beginning of the war in Ukraine to give to the Ukrainians to rebuild their economy. Russia is therefore going to have to pay the costs of what the war did to Ukraine. That's about to be done. History teaches us that this is an unspeakable mistake. In the case of Germany, did.
Try this.
I'm sorry, yeah. So it put Germany in an impossible situation. It had been wrecked by World War I, but now it couldn't rebuild because it had to send an enormous amount of money to France and Germany. And the real victor of that story was not France and Germany, because in order to fight World War I, they had to borrow the money to pay for that war from the United States. So Germany was bankrupt to pay back the French and British for the war, and they had to pay the United States back the loans that they had taken out. So the beneficiary was the United States, which was able to win the war and lend the money and get paid back. But the destruction of Germany was spectacular because you had, for those of you who don't know, the US dollar at that time went from half a dozen Deutschmark, they were called then Deutschmark, to the dollar. And in about 12 months, it was 10 billion Deutschmark to the dollar. Prices in Germany in 1923, at their peak, doubled every 20 minutes. There had to be constant repricing of everything in the supermarket. And what that meant was the German middle class, which was very frugal, it is now too. Saving money was a family tradition. And in 1 year, 50 years of family savings became the amount of money you needed to buy a quarter pound of butter. My mother, who was born and lived in Berlin at that time, remembers her parents. The father would be paid at noon from his job would run to my grandparents' home, handing off the bag of money to my grandmother, who would run to the store to spend it before it became worthless by the afternoon. That's a real inflation. That's a real collapse of your currency. And it's a paradigm case when people teach what a runaway inflation really looks like. But by bankrupting the German middle class overnight, or literally within a matter of weeks, you created a rejection of the entire capitalism and governmental apparatus that turned a desperate German working class to embrace Adolf Hitler. The price that the world paid for that collapse of capitalism is still reverberating through modern society. There is no explanation for the shift in public opinion to Hitler that does not have to take into account the fact that in a 10-year period, Germany lost World War I, went through the worst collapse of its currency and an inflation the likes of which the world has never seen, and then 5 years later is hit by the Great Depression in October of 1929. Hitler comes to power in 1932. It's a perfect example, and capitalism is prone to that. As to deflation, the best example is the period of the 1930s that followed, when prices in Germany went down. Why? Because the system was collapsing. Every capitalist was desperate to sell what they had at whatever price they could get. And the prices went down, which is why the working class in the 1930s, in many parts of the world, including the United States, did not see its real wages go down for those who had a job, because the prices went down faster than the wages went down for those who could keep a job. And so the standard of living became much more sharply divided between those who were employed and those who weren't. And that created such a force among the unemployed that they brought Mr. Roosevelt into office all across the history of the United States is a history of the ups and downs of capitalism. And the irony, and this was the other topic that Clara and I had talked about with the organizers to talk about, is that the latest irony that capitalism imposes on the United States is the fact that capitalism has no home. Capitalism starts in New England, exhausts New England and moves to the Middle West, and then exhausts the Middle West and moves to California and the South, leaving behind what you all know is all over New England, those brick buildings 4 stories high that are the old factories that were once part of a vibrant capitalist economy. And now we are all dealing with the latest movement of capital, which is out of the United States, which is to China and India and Brazil and everywhere else. Capitalism has abandoned the United States in large part. And all it gets in this country is a denial of all of that, a pretense that it can still run the world. That's why they're losing in Ukraine. That's why they can't handle the situation in Israel, Gaza. This is a system that is a little bit like that cartoon character when I was a kid. Remember that funny bird that runs off the edge of the cliff and keeps running, and then it looks down and realizes it's run out of cliff. And then we're that bird. We just haven't yet looked down.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick. Any other questions? We have about 3 to 4 minutes if anybody else has any comments. Yes.
I was wondering, I'll speak loudly. About employer-employee relationship. So let's say I have my own law firm. So I don't employ anyone. Sorry, I don't employ anyone. But let's say if you're a small business person, you have one or you have a few employees. Do they then get like a right to vote on decisions to make? Because I think that's what your suggestion in general with the employee-employee relationship. Do away with it and have companies where workers decide what to do. So with small businesses, how does that work?
Small business, medium business, large business. Yeah, the basic idea is, if I can use the shorthand, to democratize the enterprise. To say that whatever the logic is of democracy, if the idea of democracy is you are affected by the decisions that are made in this place on these subjects, if you're affected, then you have the right to participate. You cannot be affected by people over whom you have no equivalent control. We don't allow that in our political life. We long ago, at least formally, of course, really, yes, but formally we say we vote for the mayor and we vote for the congressperson, we vote for this, and it gives us some, however real or not, some control. It's the idea. Well, if that idea is appropriate to where you live, why the hell isn't it appropriate to where you work? It's exactly the same logic. I'm affected by what the employer does, but I have no control. I don't elect him. I don't have any recall over him. Not only that, he can fire me. If I say boo, I can't fire him. And he said the absurdity is, for a country that claims to be bedrock committed to democracy, the fraud is obvious. We've never allowed democracy in the workplace. And that's where people spend most of their lives as adults. And that's where people are utterly dependent on that employer for the very ability to keep going as a family or as an individual. And we don't have a democracy there. And we run around the world teaching the rest of the world how to have a democracy, which we don't have. It's an extraordinary thing. Now, if the question is, how do you manage it? Well, the reality is there are large parts of the world, it may come as a shock to you, that have a lot of experience in how to do this. We are not beginning from scratch with this idea. We are backward in this country. Spain has the Mondragon Corporation that has 60, 70 years of experience. They have a whole university in Mondragon, Spain, teaching you how to organize and run a democratic enterprise with all the problems and frictions it has. And it has those. Italy has the law back in 1985 that gives government grants to people who are unemployed if they choose to start a cooperative enterprise, the Marcora law, after the name of the...
Not the cooperatives give horrible ways.
Yes, look, it's not a panacea in the sense that it solves all the problems of the world. And it's especially not a panacea if it's surrounded by capitalist institutions and rules and regulations. The amazing thing is that it exists before. I've been to the one in Mondragon because I wanted to see what it's like. That's if you've never been there, just on the southern side of the Pyrenees Mountains that separate France from Spain. It was a very, very successful. It's the seventh largest corporation in Spain. It's a co-op. It's a family of co-ops. It has over 100,000 employees. Right? It's very big, very powerful in that northern part of Spain. We have lots and lots of models that we could talk about, study. Instead, this country acts as if it doesn't exist. Most business schools in this country teach you about business as if the only organization of business there could be is capitalism. The idea that there are co-ops, that they ought to have a curriculum about it, that people want to study them, even though we have it. few thousand co-ops in the United States. And we have a United States Federation of Worker Co-ops. Go to Google, look them up, you'll see there's a whole subculture even in this country. But the general approach is denial. We are becoming, and I really mean this seriously, we are becoming a society about whom in the future it may well be said that we as a culture deny everything that conflicts with this culture. That is becoming a cultural form of coping with your realities is by saying, what reality? By insisting that it's not there. It's like all the people now with this who seem not to have understood what the relationship between Israeli and Palestinians has been for decades. You know, as if that wasn't well known. And it's not a question of whether you agree with it or disagree, but they're like, no, I don't know anything. It's just, no, you know, Putin is a thug. Putin is more popular by all public polls in Russia than any leader in the West. You don't have to like him, I don't. But to pretend that this isn't the case, if there's a war between Russia and Western Europe, Russia will be the united country, not the Europeans. That's the reality. I mean, Americans, when I say that and I give them all the statistics, they look at me like I'm the bearer of an awful piece of news that roses smell terrible. And they're not going to have it because they know that roses smell beautiful.
Definitely. Can I add one word? And then, yeah, no, definitely. No, I think, for example, what happened with the Google software engineers and workers with lately because of Project Nimbus, right? And the fact that they ultimately did not want to come to work in the morning to work on artificial intelligence that was for genocide. This is something that I think really explains well how anti-democratic our society is from the very first act of production and then, of course, distribution that we participate in, right? So these workers ultimately were fired because they were saying, no, we do not want to participate to this Project Nimbus is a contract that Google has with now with the Israeli military to provide a lot of AI for the purpose of helping them target civilians in Gaza and the West Bank, right? So I think that's really exemplary. And I think, again, I want to stress how many historical examples of actually existing worker self-management experiments there are. And in my own research, I look at what was the workers' councils, especially the big tradition that was initiated by Antonio Gramsci in Turin in 1919 and 1920. And it's really impressive how, of course, the intuition that is so obvious, but again, it has been forgotten, purposefully forgotten, is that you can't have political democracy if it's not based on economic democracy. And this is like a very basic intuition that grounds a very big tradition and that I think is really important to bring back to the table. There's The Take is a very good documentary, very simple, that was done by Naomi Klein on Argentina in the 90s, but now there's also books about Brazil and like so many cases of self-management that are real and not outer space. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.